All right, so I generally do not like to do videos with a 20 millimeter lens, but I'm speaking to you in 20 millimeters, and to kind of offset that, I'm going to do this in a 4:3 aspect ratio, which is kind of like old time movie vibe. It's a little bit more intimate, and this is a very intimate story that I'm sharing because this is something that I never want to forget. I'm like, even more than this stories in 4K thing, I just kind of want to document this because I've never really talked about this, and this is something that I want to keep as mine and share it. So the pandemic was a terrible time. I was still living in the Bronx at the time. I had been in this apartment for, I guess, like 7 years at that point, same apartment. And I was actually living on the same block that I lived in when I was a little kid. So in some ways, the pandemic was an amazing gift for me because I had a landlord in the Bronx who was a very kind of generous spirit. And he cut everybody's rent in half for 3 years when the pandemic happened, and never asked for a penny back from anybody. I know that the city had some kind of program where they paid landlords back for money they had lost during the pandemic, but the tenants had to fill out these forms and stuff, and most people didn't do it. I did it, and he got my money back, but most people were not even considerate enough to do that because most people have pretty adversarial relationships with landlords no matter what, and we certainly had our issues in that building. But when push came to shove, and when it was a really difficult time, he was a hero. And that's kind of what this video is about. It's about a hero. The other thing about the pandemic that was really kind of amazing for me, first of all, I think it's well documented, and I'm not going to get too deeply into it, but I've talked about this a lot. I was supposed to open a play, a solo play at the Signature Theater on June 12th of 2020. And it was like the biggest deal of my career. I had prepared for that thing. Like, I was more prepared for that than I had ever been prepared for anything in my life. There was going to be a hurricane on stage that night, that opening night. But anyway, it got canceled, of course, and I was devastated. But that started my filmmaking journey because I decided to take that play and turn it into a movie. So I adapted a screenplay to my theatrical script, and I shot the movie on my phone. That's when I learned how to be a filmmaker. Also, it was pretty fortunate that there was nobody out in the street, so I was able to shoot all over New York City at that time. I was even able to lay in the middle of Park Avenue, which I never would have been able to do unless there was a pandemic. So anyway, that was all good, but that's not what this video is about. It was a very, very difficult time. So because every way that I made money was eliminated during that time, obviously I'm a performing artist, so nobody was going out, everything was closed, everything was shut down, so I couldn't make money featuring as a poet or my theater work or anything. Like, I couldn't make money. So I was working for Instacart. I was shopping for people. And, it was kind of scary because I was out there every day, and most people were, in their homes. And in fact, I was one of the only people allowed to be out because I was considered an essential worker. And so it was just surreal, like driving around New York City, being on, places like the Cross Bronx Expressway or the Major Deegan or 287 or Gun Hill Road or Webster Avenue or these, the Grand Concourse, Fordham Road, like places that were generally like bumper to bumper all the time. Loud sounds, honking horns, people screaming. It was just silence and empty. And the only people out you knew were other essential workers. The only people I saw in the stores were people doing what I was doing, or the workers putting out produce, putting out food, like the people who were doing stuff that was essential for the population to be able to eat, to have, there were nurses for healthcare, things like that. So yeah, I was wearing gloves all the time. Like I wore rubber gloves. I was washing my hands so much that my skin was like bleeding every day. I had, at the time they hadn't made masks yet. So I was ripping up all these old t-shirts and making these impromptu masks. It was crazy. It was a crazy time. And it was scary. People were, like, I go to people's homes to deliver stuff, and they would just like look out the window. They wouldn't even open the door, and I would just have to leave stuff. And people were afraid to go near anybody. Nobody was coming close to anyone. But in the stores, we kind of looked at each other like, we're out here together. Like, this is us. We're doing something kind of cool. And I made quite a bit of money at that time too. People were tipping very well. And you know what? I hadn't had to do work like that ever as an artist, and I was proud to do that. And I was fortunate too, because I need, even though my rent was cut in half, I still had to cover that half and my utilities, and I had to eat, and so I needed the money. So it was very difficult. One thing that was kind of ironic, it's always hard to park in New York City, park your car. As a matter of fact, the reason I moved out of the city is because I never wanted to look for a parking space for 3 hours again, ever in my life. So anyway, if you left the city during the pandemic, nobody was driving. Nobody was going anywhere. So when you came home, it was really hard to find a parking space, like crazy hard. So generally I would come home at night, and it would take me 3 hours just driving around in circles all over my neighborhood. Usually I had to park maybe a mile or two away, usually in some shady place, in the middle of nowhere, under the train on Jerome Avenue, or by, DeWitt Clinton High School had this long empty road where there was nobody. And, I was always like, my car's going to get broken into or stolen or something, but nothing ever happened. But I was parking pretty far away during that time. So here's the story that I wanted to share, that I wanted to keep forever. Parked my car one night after doing all this stuff, and I was coming home. And as usual, there was nobody on the streets. And I was walking down Rochambeau Avenue, which was my block in the Bronx, which, is usually a pretty busy street. And when I got home, I looked in the courtyard of my building. There was this young woman sitting on the steps, and she was crying. And so immediately in my head, I was like, I hope nothing bad happened to her, or, I didn't know what to think, but I felt this energy, like she was sobbing. I mean, she was crying hard. And so anyway, I didn't want to embarrass her. I didn't want to, invade her space, her privacy. She looked a little startled when I showed up, but she just sat there, and we kind of looked at each other for a minute, and then I just kept walking. But I don't know, like I didn't want to, kind of, like I say, invade her space or anything, but I couldn't walk past her like that. I had to make sure she was okay. So I stopped and I asked her, I just looked down and I said, "Are you okay? Did anything happen? Do you need anything?" And she just kind of looked at me, and she nodded like this, and then she was just like inconsolable. She couldn't stop crying. So I don't know, I couldn't leave. So I sat down next to her. And, like I said, this was the pandemic. People were not going near each other. So I didn't get too close, but we were sitting probably, you're supposed to stay 6 feet apart during the pandemic. Maybe I was 1.5 feet from her or something like that. I guess maybe because of the moment I forgot. And I sat down, and she just kind of nudged towards me. She put her head on my shoulder, and she took my hand, and she was just sobbing. And, it was weird. I just felt, I don't know, I felt honored by that moment for some reason. And I had no idea what was going on. And, I didn't really ask. I figured if she wanted to talk about it, she would talk about it. I just sat there. I just said, what, I'm just going to be here. And it felt kind of good for me too. We had been so isolated in that kind of way, even though this was a complete stranger who apparently lived in my building, although I didn't even know that. I didn't know who she was. So finally we got to talking, and she said, "I'm a nurse up at Monte." And I'm like, "What's Monte?" And she goes, "Montefiore Hospital." We lived right up the block from Montefiore Hospital. And I was like, "Oh, I didn't know people called it Monte." She goes, "Yeah." And she said, I've seen you in the building before. And like I said, I had lived there for like 7 years already. She goes, I see you in the morning go running. But I had never seen her before. So apparently she grew up in that building. Her mother was born in that building, so she had lived there for a long time. It was like her building. Although I lived in the building across the street when I was a baby. My grandmother lived right across the street when I was first fostered and adopted. So anyway, we talked a little bit, and she said, I'm a nurse up there, and it's just been so horrible. And tonight, I lost it. I just couldn't take it anymore. And so I didn't want to go home. I didn't want to put this on my family. And she said, I've been a nurse for 18 years. And she said, I have seen more people die. I have been in the presence of more death in the last 90 days than in the whole time I've been a nurse, in almost 20 years. And she said, tonight I lost it because, a lot of people are dying alone, like their families are not allowed to come to the hospital. They're not allowed to visit them. Nobody was allowed in. The patients were there all by themselves around strangers, and so many people were dying. Every night there was one of those ice trucks outside of Montefiore, and that, I don't know if you know about those, but the morgues around New York City was just full. And so they were putting dead bodies in these ice trucks. And I walked past this truck every morning, and I felt the energy of that truck. It was like it was fucking my head up, like I definitely felt what was in that truck, and I used to think too, like, who are these people? What are their families like? What were their lives like? And I couldn't help but think, what was their ending like? And so here I'm sitting next to this woman, and she's telling me, she said today an elderly gentleman died, and I sat with him all day, and he just kept asking for his family, and he was crying all day, and he knew he couldn't see his family, but he just was so upset. And so I just sat with him all day. And I sat with him until his last breath, and I was holding his hand, and he thanked me for being with him. And she said, I just couldn't handle it anymore. I wanted him to be able to be with his wife and his kids, and he just couldn't. And he was with me, a total stranger. And, it just occurred to me that, my landlord was a hero at that time. All these essential workers were heroes. She was a real hero. And, I personally knew quite a few nurses in New York City, actually from the poetry community, just some friends of mine who were nurses and who I'm positive experienced unspeakable things during the pandemic. It was something that, nobody was prepared for. Nobody knew what to do. We didn't know how to handle this. It was a disease that was brand new that nobody knew about. And so as much as the nurses were like triage, ready for anything, emergencies, they just didn't know how to deal with this. And people were dying, and they were there every day, and there for way too many hours, completely overworked. They showed up every day. And they were there for these patients, and they were the only comfort. Not just the medical side of it, but the emotional side of it. They were there for them every day, many times to the end of their lives, in place of their families. And I never want to forget that, as much as it was some of the most horrible days of my life, and a lot of people in my building passed away during that time. I'll never forget that girl. The girl who I never saw, who lived there the whole time I was there. I'll never forget her. I'll never forget her spirit, her generosity of allowing me into that moment. I felt honored by that. I felt fortunate. I told her, I said, you made me feel good. I miss this kind of human contact. And, I don't know. I haven't really talked about this story much since it happened. I mean, I've talked about it to a couple of people maybe, but I haven't really. I talk about a lot of stories, and for some reason that was so private and so intimate. I'll never forget that, and I'll never forget that woman, that hero. and my landlord and the people in the stores and the Instacart workers who I would see every day, Uber drivers, people who were taking care of the other people who were stuck at home. I'll never forget that day, and I'll never forget that time. And I'll never take a day of my life for granted. As difficult as it gets sometimes for me. I don't know. I think things really haven't felt like they've gotten back to normal for me ever anyway. But I just think about that moment, and I just think about it with love. That was an amazing, amazing night.